It's March 1921, and a convoy of charabancs packed with armed men from Birmingham is rolling toward the Epsom Racecourse. They've got razors sewn into the peaks of their caps, revolvers stuffed into coat pockets, and hammers wrapped in newspaper. They're not here to place bets. They're here to take back an empire worth millions of pounds a year from an Italian family that muscled them off their own turf. What happens next will be one of the bloodiest gang battles in British history, and it makes anything Tommy Shelby ever did on screen look like a polite disagreement. But to understand how we got to this moment, we need to go back decades, to a time when the British government made a single catastrophic decision that accidentally created one of the most powerful criminal networks the country has ever seen. In 1853, the British Parliament passed the Betting Houses Act. The idea was simple and, on paper, noble. Gambling was destroying working-class families. Men were losing their wages in betting shops instead of feeding their children. So Parliament shut every legal betting house in the country. Problem solved, right? Spectacularly wrong. What they actually did was hand the entire gambling economy of Britain to criminals. See, here's the thing, politicians didn't understand then, and frankly still struggle with now. Making something illegal doesn't make demand disappear. It just moves the supply underground. Before 1853, a man could walk into a licensed betting shop and place a wager on a horse. After 1853, that same man walked into a back alley and handed his money to a street bookie who answered to a gang. The gambling didn't stop. It just became invisible, unregulated, and enormously profitable for anyone willing to break the law. And the demand was staggering. By some estimates, by the late Victorian era, illegal cash betting in Britain involved tens of millions of pounds annually. Adjusted for inflation, we're talking about a shadow economy worth billions in today's money. Every factory, every mill, every dockyard had its own unofficial bookie. Workers would place bets on their lunch breaks, passing slips of paper and coins through intermediaries called runners. The runners passed the bets up to the bookmaker. The bookmaker passed a cut-up to whoever controlled the territory. It was a franchise model that would make modern corporations jealous, and it ran entirely outside the law. Now the show Peaky Blinders gets the broad strokes of this right. Tommy Shelby runs a betting operation. He has muscle. He has territory. But the show dramatically underplays the sheer organizational sophistication of what was actually happening in cities like Birmingham, London, Leeds, Glasgow, and Manchester. A real illegal betting operation in the late 1800s and early 1900s worked like this. At the bottom, you had the runners, sometimes kids as young as 10, who would collect bets from workers in factories and pubs. They'd memorize the bets or carry tiny slips of paper that could be swallowed if police appeared. Above them sat the street bookmakers, who operated from fixed positions, usually a street corner, a doorway, or the back room of a pub. These bookies paid rent, not to a landlord, but to whichever gang controlled that patch of city. Above the gangs sat the big bookmakers, men who operated at the racecourses themselves, taking enormous wages and setting the odds that trickled down to every street corner in the country. The racecourses were the nerve center of the whole system. Whoever controlled the pitches at the races, the physical spots where bookmakers could set up and take bets, controlled the lifeblood of gambling across Britain. And controlling those pitches required one thing above all else: violence. This is where the real Peaky Blinders enter the story, and the truth is both less glamorous and more brutal than the television version. The actual Peaky Blinders were a street gang operating in the small Heath area of Birmingham in the 1890s. They were not criminal masterminds in tailored overcoats. They were young, poor, and vicious. The name likely came from their peaked caps, though the romantic story about razor blades sewn into the brims is almost certainly a myth. They were one of dozens of similar gangs across Birmingham. Groups like the Sloggers, the Gun Quarter Gang, and later the much more significant Birmingham Boys. By the early 1900s, the original Peaky Blinders had largely faded, but the Birmingham criminal networks they were part of evolved into something far more dangerous under men like Billy Kimber. Kimber is the real figure behind what the show turns into Tommy Shelby's empire. He was a racecourse gang leader who, by the end of World War I, controlled the betting pitches at tracks across the Midlands and southern England. His Birmingham Boys collected protection money from bookmakers at every race meeting. If you wanted to take bets at a racecourse, you paid Kimber's men. If you refused, you got beaten, slashed, or worse. It was a protection racket identical in structure to anything the Sicilian Mafia was running in New York at the same time. The methods were the same. The intimidation was the same. The scale was comparable, but Kimber had a problem. London, Charles Sabini, known as Darby Sabini, was the son of Italian immigrants living in the Clerkenwell district of London, an area so densely populated with Italians it was called Little Italy. By the end of the First World War, Sabini had assembled his own gang and set his sights on the racecourse pitches that Kimber controlled. What followed was a gang war that lasted years and turned English racecourses into battlegrounds. We're talking coordinated ambushes with dozens of men on each side, armed with razors, hatchets, iron bars, and guns. The attack at Epsom in 1921 that I opened with was one of the most infamous. Kimber's Birmingham boys descended on the racecourse looking for Sabini's men. Running battles broke out. Men were slashed across the face. Bookmakers who'd sided with the wrong gang were beaten unconscious. Police were overwhelmed and in many documented cases simply looked the other way because they were on someone's payroll. And that brings us to one of the most critical elements the show only hints at: police corruption. In cities like Birmingham and London, entire police divisions were compromised. Officers received weekly payments from gang leaders to ignore illegal betting operations. Some officers actively worked as enforcers, tipping off gangs about raids or feeding information about rivals. One investigation in the 1920s found that officers in certain London divisions were earning more from bribes than from their official salaries. The system wasn't just tolerated by corrupt cops. In many neighborhoods, the system couldn't function without them. Darby Sabini eventually won the racecourse war, at least in the South. He controlled the pitches at tracks like Epsom, Brighton, Seine, and Kempton Park throughout the 1920s and into the 1930s. His operation was pulling in the equivalent of millions per year, and he lived like a king in London while maintaining a reputation for sudden, terrifying violence against anyone who challenged his authority. So what finally ended it? Not a hero cop, not a government crackdown. Mostly it was World War II and slow legislative change. The war disrupted racing schedules and scattered the gangs. Sabini, as an Italian national, was actually interned during the war under Defense Regulation 18B. His empire collapsed without him. Kimber had already faded from power years earlier after a series of arrests and internal betrayals. But the real death blow came in 1961 with the Betting and Gaming Act, which finally legalized off-course betting shops. Almost overnight, the law created a legitimate industry that drained the customer base from the street bookies. The same thing the 1853 Act had created by prohibiting gambling, the 1961 Act destroyed by permitting it. Licensed betting shops opened across Britain, and within a few years, the vast criminal infrastructure that had controlled gambling for over a century simply withered. The gangs didn't disappear, of course. They moved into other rackets. But the specific machine of illegal betting, the runners and the street bookies and the racecourse pitches, that machine was done. Here's what Peaky Blinders gets fundamentally wrong, or at least incomplete. The show frames the betting empire as one man's ambition. Tommy Shelby's genius, Tommy Shelby's vision. The real story is almost the opposite. The illegal gambling underworld wasn't built by brilliant individuals. It was built by a structural failure of law. Parliament created a black market and then spent over 100 years being shocked that criminals filled the vacuum. The gangs that rose to control it, the Peaky Blinders, Billy Kimber's Birmingham boys, the Sabini family, they weren't anomalies. They were inevitable. Every city in Britain had its own version. The specifics varied, but the architecture was always the same. Demand plus prohibition equals organized crime. And the parallels to modern debates are uncomfortable and obvious. Every time a government bans a product or service that millions of people want, someone steps in to supply it outside the law. The Victorian betting underworld is a case study in what happens when policy ignores human behavior. So here's what I want to know from you. Given that legalizing betting in 1961 effectively dismantled these criminal empires, do you think the century of gang violence that preceded it was an unavoidable consequence of prohibition? Or could the British government have cracked down hard enough to actually eliminate illegal gambling without legalization? Drop your argument in the comments because I genuinely think there's a strong case on both sides. And if this kind of real history behind the fiction is what you're into, this channel is where it lives. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.